They survived by watching entire worlds collapse under their feet before they learned to walk. Every sign they followed was carved from someone else's fear, someone else's final moment, someone else's warning left in stone. You may think their lives were distant or primitive, yet the earth they feared has never stopped moving beneath us. Tonight we step into their silence and learn how they stayed alive when the world turned against them. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were standing among prehistoric people during a quiet morning, they would notice how often their eyes drifted upward, watching the sky with a patience that came from necessity rather than curiosity. The early light always revealed something that mattered to them. The tint of blue, the stretch of pale clouds, the direction the wind carried dust. Nothing was ever just scenery. Every change meant something, even when they did not speak of it. A darker shade near the horizon could unsettle an entire group. A sudden stillness in the air could make even the children fall silent. They lived in a world where the sky did not simply decorate their lives. It ruled them. The first sense they trusted was their sight. They memorized the sky from season to season, noticing slight differences that most people today would overlook. When clouds moved faster than usual, they paid attention. When they spun low across the treetops, some would begin packing whatever they had. They did not call it a storm. They did not give it a name. It was only the world shifting into danger, and they learned to shift with it. The wrong shade of grey, the wrong kind of wind, the wrong stillness. These things were enough to make them leave a resting place without hesitation. Their sense of smell guided them just as much. Many of them could notice the metallic scent in the air before the rain arrived, or the strange dry heat that sometimes preceded distant lightning. A damp heaviness drifting through the trees often meant flooding would follow. No one taught them these details. They simply lived long enough to remember what happened the last time the air felt the same. It is almost darkly amusing that people today rely on phone alerts, while these early humans needed only a shift in scent to prepare for danger. They walked through life carrying memories of storms, winds, and disasters inside their bodies, and those memories kept them alive. Animals were their constant reference. A flock of birds lifting too abruptly could cause an entire tribe to pause mid-step. When insects disappeared, people knew the air was turning wrong. If the usual nighttime calls of creatures went quiet, they understood something larger was moving through the land. Children grew up watching their elders stare at the tree line, listening not for a particular sound, but for the absence of one. Fear was not dramatic for them. It was simply another tool. They had no interest in pretending the world was gentle. They noticed everything because not noticing meant dying. A gust of wind that felt unfamiliar could trigger a whisper among the adults. A strange shadow across the ground could send people gathering their belongings. Their survival depended on awareness so constant that it barely felt conscious. The world did not give warnings out of kindness. It gave signs, and the people who lived long enough were the ones who learned to read them before the signs turned into consequences. Clean blue skies did not comfort them, and heavy clouds did not frighten them on their own. What mattered was the pattern. A wind that shifted direction too quickly could mean fire. A sudden cooling of the ground could mean the approach of rain that would flood their shelters. Every detail had weight. Every detail had its own history tied to it. The elders carried these histories quietly, passing them on without speeches or explanations. A raised eyebrow, a slowed step, a lingering look at the sky, these were their warnings. Their shelters reflected this quiet vigilance. They placed them in locations that allowed a wide view of the horizon. They avoided valleys where storms gathered force and avoided cliffsides where landslides could strike. Their lives were built around the understanding that nature did not negotiate. They did not have the luxury of ignoring subtle cues. If the wind blew strangely, they did not wait for confirmation. Waiting was a privilege they did not possess. If one were to compare this way of living to modern life, it would feel like imagining a world where weather reports came only from instinct, sharpened by fear, rather than screens glowing with confidence. The early humans trusted their senses because they had nothing else. And when their senses failed, the cost was immediate. They remembered these losses more clearly than they remembered victories. Their attention extended beyond storms. Dry air that lingered too long could signal drought. The smell of dust rising thick behind hills could mean stronger winds approaching. Even the way sunlight bent through clouds could tell them whether to travel or stay put. There was no separation between them and the environment. They did not watch nature from a distance. They lived inside its moods and movements every day. Children learned this quickly. They watched how adults paused before taking a step, how they tested the air with a slow breath, how they closed their eyes to listen. This was survival education delivered wordlessly. They were raised to notice everything, because the world punished those who noticed too late. Sometimes I think the quiet precision of their attention says more about human fragility than any tool they ever built. Nothing about this vigilance was heroic. It was not dramatic or impressive. It was simply the baseline of existence. They adapted because the world forced them to. They paid attention because ignoring reality meant death without hesitation. They looked up at the sky each morning, not because it was beautiful, but because it could decide their fate before nightfall. Awareness was their shelter long before they learned to build anything from stone or wood. They survived because they learned to see danger before it had a name. Yet there were moments when the ground shifted faster than their memories could guide them, and somewhere beneath their feet a force waited to break the world open without warning. They learned early that the land could not be trusted. A place that looked calm in the morning could turn deadly by nightfall, and a resting ground that felt safe for weeks could betray them without warning. Every choice about where to sleep, cook, and gather was made under the shadow of past disasters. The stories of those who died were not told dramatically. They were woven into habits that shaped where they placed their feet and how long they stayed in any one spot. It was not fear that directed them, but memory sharpened by consequences that never allowed themselves to fade. They avoided the edges of rivers, even when the water seemed thin and harmless. They knew the banks could give way under sudden pressure. Heavy rains far away could swell a distant stream into a violent flood without a single cloud passing overhead. To settle too close was an invitation to be swept away in the dark. They had seen it before, entire shelters taken by water, while people slept inside, unaware of the fast-moving current, until it was inside their lungs. The calmness of flowing water meant nothing to them. They had lived long enough to see how silence often preceded destruction. They also kept their distance from the bases of the mountains. Loose earth, hidden fractures, and shifting stones could turn a slope into an avalanche without warning. A loud crack, a trembling patch of soil, or a few pebbles tumbling down were all it took for an entire community to move on. Even when food was plentiful near a rocky region, they approached it with caution. They understood that the weight of the world pressed down on those cliffs, and the cliffs sometimes answered back. Those who ignored such signs rarely survived long enough to be remembered. High ground became their natural refuge. Elevated land, with firm soil, allowed them to see dangers approaching before those dangers reached them. From above, they could notice the direction of animals, fleeing the rise of smoke from distant fires, or the shimmer of water where it should not be. The elevation was not for comfort. It was a vantage point against the unpredictability of nature. They often built temporary shelters on these ridges, knowing full well that even the safest ground could turn unsafe in time. Nothing was permanent, not even security. They preferred soil that did not shift easily. They tested it by pressing their heels deep into the earth and watching how it responded. A surface that crumbled meant instability, and they would abandon it even if it was otherwise ideal. They learned to read the firmness of dirt the same way they read clouds. Solid ground meant a solid chance of survival. It is strangely bleak to realize that long before architecture or engineering, humans already understood that the wrong choice of ground could kill as surely as a blade. They carried this knowledge without pride. It was simply part of living. Even when they chose high, stable ground, they never moved too far from water. They knew they needed it daily, yet they refused to live next to it. So they compromised, picking places high enough to escape sudden floods, but close enough that reaching the river did not exhaust them. Their daily routines included checking water levels, watching for debris floating downstream, and feeling the air for moisture. Any sign that the river might misbehave would cause them to adjust their distance again. Their movement patterns formed a rhythm, shaped by danger rather than convenience. They remained wary of places that felt too comfortable. A quiet valley with abundant resources might seem appealing, but experience taught them that nature often saved its harshest surprises for the places that tempted people into staying too long. So they kept their shelters minimal, their belongings light, and their stays temporary. Permanence was a risk they were unwilling to take. If one were to compare this mindset to the modern desire for certainty, it would seem like a world built entirely on the expectation that stability is an illusion. They made decisions silently, often communicating only through glances or small gestures. Someone might notice the wind shifting strangely and tighten their jaw. Another might see cracks forming in the ground and slowly begin to gather tools. The group understood these signals instantly. They trusted each other's instincts because they were shaped by shared losses. They never questioned the need to move. Movement had saved them too many times to doubt it. Children grew up learning this instinctive caution. They followed adults on scouting walks, stepping where the older ones stepped, touching the earth where the older ones tested it, watching shadows fall across the terrain with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. They did not need explanations. The land had already given them its lessons, and the elders made sure those lessons were remembered. And sometimes, I think their constant vigilance reveals how deeply humans have always feared the quiet moments before disaster. They did not seek beauty in the landscape, they sought reliability. A calm field was examined for hidden depressions. A wide open plain was checked for wind patterns that could carry fire. A forest was evaluated by the strength of its old trees. Every choice had weight. A wrong judgment could end the lives of many, and such memories were never forgotten. Their understanding of danger accumulated, slowly carried through generations, and was etched into behavior more than speech. This constant evaluation of where to live did not make them anxious. It made them prepared. They did not demand safety from the world because they had never known such a thing existed. Instead, they learned to adapt, adjust, and anticipate. Their understanding of land was not technical or scientific. It was intimate. It was the understanding of people who lived with nature, not as scenery, but as a force capable of both sustaining and erasing them. Their survival depended on the brief signals they traded when danger pressed too close. Yet there were storms that no amount of warning could scatter in time. And somewhere beyond their circle of voices, the first breath of an unnamed threat was already stirring. Danger rarely arrived with noise. Most of the time it crept in quietly, spreading through the land long before anyone saw it. That was why the people relied so heavily on the way they communicated with one another. They had no written signs, no tools for long distances, and no time to debate when something felt wrong. Their lives depended on the speed at which a single observation could pass from one person to the next. A quick gesture, a sharp sound, or a single glance could decide whether a group survived or vanished beneath a force larger than any of them. Hands were their first language in moments of threat. A raised palm could tell others to freeze. A swing of the arm could send children running towards safer ground. A simple tightening of the fingers could mean that someone had seen movement in the trees or felt the ground shift underfoot. These signals were learned early, long before children understood the meaning of danger itself. They obeyed because obedience kept them alive. The gestures were quiet, unbroken by panic, and refined through generations that had lost too many people to hesitation. Sound came next, brief, sharp, and unmistakable. A low whistle carried across valleys without revealing their exact location. A short rising howl warned of threats that could move quickly. Striking stones together created a rhythm that echoed across slopes, telling scattered hunters to return immediately. None of these noises was used casually. Each sound had a weight equal to the dangers they had faced. It is quietly unsettling to imagine how their version of an alarm system was built, not from technology, but from memories of what had happened to those who failed to signal in time. During storms, communication became even more essential. Wind drowned out voices, rain blurred vision, and the land itself became unpredictable. When lightning cracked the sky, elders would step forward, relying on old experiences rather than confidence. They had lived through collapses of shelters, sudden floods, and unpredictable winds. Their role was not earned by their age alone, but by the patterns they had memorized, the patterns that others were still learning to recognize. A single gesture from an elder could scatter the group in silence, sending them toward higher ground or deeper into the forest with a clarity that required no explanation. The group trusted these elders completely. Even when they did not understand the reason for a decision, they moved without question. The elders carried the weight of previous losses. They remembered the nights when the sky cracked open and the days when the river rose faster than anyone believed possible. Children watched them constantly, trying to absorb the subtle ways they reacted to changes. They learned that survival was not loud or dramatic. It happened quietly through small decisions, guided by knowledge passed from one generation to the next. When disaster pressed close enough to force evacuation, the group never moved as a single crowd. They knew that panic could spread faster than fire if too many people tried to flee in the same direction. Instead, they separated into small clusters, each with someone responsible for guiding them. It reduced confusion, kept parents close to children, and allowed the group to move more efficiently across uneven terrain. If one were to compare this to modern emergency drills, it becomes clear that these early humans understood crowd psychology long before anyone attempted to study it. Each cluster moved with its own rhythm. Some advanced quickly because they had fewer belongings. Others moved more slowly because older members struggled across rocks or through thick brush. But no group was abandoned. People doubled back when someone fell behind, lifting them, pulling them forward or shielding them from danger. The quiet coordination was not heroic, it was expected. Their unity came from necessity rather than loyalty. Individuals who acted alone rarely survived long enough to be remembered. Their communication extended even into fear. When the earth trembled or the sky darkened, suddenly no one screamed. They had learned that loud panic could confuse the group, overwhelm their signals or attract predators. Their response to fear was silence, heavy, shared and controlled. Even the children felt it. They watched the faces of adults for signs of urgency, reading a tightened jaw or widened eyes, the way someone today might read a written warning. Sometimes I think their restraint in the face of terror reveals more about the fragility of human survival than any tool they carved from stone. They also used the environment itself to send messages. Stones arranged in certain patterns warned those returning from hunts. Sticks broken in deliberate ways signaled unsafe territory. Marks scratched into tree bark indicated recent activity from dangerous animals or changes in weather. These messages lasted when voices could not reach far enough. Hunters returning late could recognize a signal, even in fading light, and adjust their path before stepping into danger. None of this communication was formal or planned. It grew naturally from necessity. The people refined these systems through loss, not invention. When a gesture failed to warn quickly enough, they changed it. When a sound didn't travel far, they abandoned it. What remained were the methods that saved lives repeatedly, sharpened by centuries of trial and error. They never stopped adjusting. Their world did not allow complacency. The land shifted, storms rose, and predators moved silently through tall grass. Communication had to evolve as quickly as the dangers did. This reliance on subtle signals created a network of awareness that connected every member of the group. Even those too young to speak clearly understood the urgency behind sudden gestures. Elders could sense panic in someone's breathing before they heard a word. They were bound together not by laws or authority, but by the understanding that survival depended on how well they interpreted one another. Their silence carried meaning. Their movements carried urgency. Their coordination carried life. They functioned as a single organism when danger approached many bodies, sharing the same instinct. Disasters did not give them the luxury of discussion. The world punished hesitation cruelly. They lived knowing that warning each other quickly was often their only defense. And yet, despite the risks, their communication remained calm, efficient, and deeply human. They survived because danger traveled faster through their signals than through the air around them. Yet even with all their warnings, some threats rose too quietly to detect. Somewhere beyond their reach, a shift in the world waited for the moment when no signal would be enough. Storms did not announce themselves in the world these early humans lived in. There were no warnings printed on stone, no voices carried from distant settlements, and no tool that allowed them to anticipate the weight of approaching wind. What they had instead was something quieter, something far more ancient, the subtle discomfort that crawled beneath the skin when the sky began to shift. They had no name for this sensation, but they trusted it far more than any explanation they could have invented. The heaviness in the chest, the tightening of muscles, and the prickle at the back of the neck became signals they relied on long before the first drop of rain fell. Their world reacted before they did. In the hours leading up to a storm, the air thickened until breathing felt different. Light dimmed in strange ways, as though the sky were reconsidering how brightly it should shine. Birds stopped calling, not gradually, but all at once, leaving a silence that felt unnatural. Even the insects changed their patterns. When the smallest creatures vanished into crevices, families began to gather their few possessions without speaking. They had seen too many storms rip apart their shelters to ignore the signs. No one waited for confirmation. Waiting was dangerous. Instead, they observed every detail, how clouds stretched across the horizon like heavy blankets, how wind shifted from warm to cold in the space of a breath, and how the ground seemed to hold tension just before lightning struck. It seems almost absurd that without any knowledge of meteorology, they often sensed danger more accurately than many people do with modern tools. They were tuned to their environment in a way that made hesitation feel reckless. Their instincts came not from guesswork, but from patterns noticed over generations. A sudden quietness in the forest meant the storm would be severe. A sharp metallic scent rising from the earth meant lightning was near. A deep rumble beneath the wind indicated that rain would fall harder than usual. These people did not discuss these signs openly. Speaking too much about danger gave it weight, and weight gave it power. Instead, they exchanged glances that carried decisions: move, prepare, hide, abandon. When the first gusts of wind arrived, they felt the difference immediately. Harmless breezes moved playfully through the trees, but storm wind pushed with intention. It came in uneven bursts, as if testing the world before tearing into it. Those who had survived previous storms recognized the feeling of a coming downpour in their bones. If we were to compare this sensitivity to modern life, it would be like noticing danger in the faint hum of an electrical line before a blackout. Their perception was not mystical, it was practiced. Children learned this awareness early. They watched adults pause at the slightest change in pressure. They saw shelters reinforced with stones and branches, even before rain appeared. They heard the short huffs adults made when the air tasted wrong. To them, storms were not just weather. They were living forces with tempers stronger than any animal. The group taught them to respect the sky in the same way they respected predators. Never assume it would remain calm. When the clouds thickened, people began to gather closer, as though proximity itself could protect them. But their unity was not panicked. It was preparation. They packed food tightly in hides to keep it dry. They secured young children between sturdier adults who could shield them. They removed sharp stones from the ground inside the shelter to prevent injury when the wind forced the structure to shake. These tasks were done swiftly, each person repeating motions learned from the disasters of those who came before them. The storms that struck without warning were the ones they feared most. There were times when the signs were too subtle: a faint tremor in leaves, a distant shift in animal behavior, or a humidity change so delicate that only the oldest members sensed it. When storms arrived, suddenly ripping branches from trees and sending debris flying across the ground, the group relied entirely on instinct. Quiet panic moved through them, not loud or frantic, but sharp enough to speed their decisions. They did not run blindly. They moved with purpose, because running without direction could kill as quickly as the storm. When lightning flashed, the world froze for a breath. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the ground, and for a moment everything looked suspended between life and destruction. Thunder followed, rolling across the land, with a force that made even the strongest adults flinch. They recognized this sequence well, the flash that warned, the boom that punished, the wind that chased afterward. These moments shaped their understanding of the sky more than any peaceful day ever could. Sometimes I think their respect for storms reveals more about human vulnerability than any story about bravery. Despite their awareness and preparation, storms still took lives. A tree falling in the wrong direction, a shelter collapsing under saturated soil, a sudden rush of wind catching someone alone. These were tragedies. The group absorbed quietly. They mourned not with ritual, but with memory. Each loss sharpened their instincts further. Danger was a teacher who allowed no forgiveness. They did not fear storms because storms were common. They feared the storms that behaved differently, the ones that ignored patterns, the ones that arrived earlier than expected, the ones whose winds carried a sound they had never heard before. Those were the storms that reminded them that nature was not predictable, only observable. They endured by listening to the world long before it raised its voice. Yet some dangers gathered silently, hiding their force behind calm skies. Some storms waited until every sign was overlooked before revealing what they carried. The earth beneath them was never as still as it appeared, and those who lived long enough learned that the ground could betray them faster than any predator. The first warning was never loud. It came as a faint trembling under the soles of their feet, something so slight that an inattentive person might mistake it for their own heartbeat. But for people who spent their lives watching every shift in their surroundings, that tiny quiver was enough to change everything. They did not wait to confirm what they already understood. The moment the earth stirred, bodies tensed, eyes widened, and instincts took over. They had no words for earthquake, no way to describe the forces that moved beneath them. They only knew what happened when the shaking grew stronger. Caves that sheltered them could collapse without warning. Stones stacked into walls could tumble onto sleeping children. The safest ground could split open like the skin of a fruit. And they had seen all of these things before. Loss had taught them that hesitation was fatal. When the ground whispered, they ran. The first step was always to get out of enclosed spaces. Shelters built into rock faces, which protected them from storms and predators, became deadly traps the moment the earth shifted. People rushed out with the urgency of those who had seen roofs fall and stones crack open. They did not shout, shouting wasted breath and sowed confusion. Instead, they used sharp gestures, hands slicing through the air, arms pushing others forward, eyes signaling the direction of safety. It is grimly ironic that their most reliable warning system came not from the sky or animals, but from the very ground they depended on. Once outside, their priority was distance. They moved away from cliffs where rocks might rain down, away from trees whose branches snapped unpredictably, and away from slopes that could release sudden cascades of debris. Open land was their only refuge, even if it offered no comfort. They ran until the ground beneath them felt less treacherous, until the shaking slowed, or their legs could no longer carry them. Some stumbled, some crawled, but they kept moving, because stillness was just another way of offering themselves to the earth's violence. The shaking did not always come in one wave. Sometimes it arrived in pulses, small rumblings followed by silence, then a violent jolt that knocked people to their knees. They learned this pattern through suffering. Whenever the tremors paused, they did not assume the danger had passed. They used the moment to move farther, to help the slower members of the group to brace themselves for what might follow. If we compare this to how people today rely on structured emergency protocols, these early humans survived with nothing but instinct sharpened by fear. Their understanding was not scientific, but it was accurate enough to save their lives. Children clung to adults, feeling the trembling through their bodies rather than through the ground. Those who were old enough to run stayed close to the elders, watching how they scanned the terrain for falling hazards. They copied these movements without understanding their purpose fully, but imitation was enough. The elders had survived long enough to read the land. Their memory of past disasters guided the group's direction, even when visibility was low or dust filled the air. The people also listened. Earthquakes produced sounds that were subtle at first, a faint grinding underfoot, a rustle among loose stones, a shifting echo inside hollow spaces. But when the tremors grew stronger, the earth groaned in a way that left no doubt. It was a deep, resonant noise that traveled through soil and bone alike. Hearing it once made a person cautious. Hearing it twice made them fearful. Hearing it many times made them wise. The wise did not stay near anything that could fall. Open areas became crowded as the group clustered together. They stood apart from one another, just enough to avoid collisions if they lost balance, yet close enough to support someone who stumbled. No one sat down. No one tried to rest. They waited until the shaking faded completely, until the dust settled, until the echoes inside the earth quieted. Only then did they move again, checking shelters for damage and ensuring that no one had been left behind in more dangerous places. Even after the earth stopped moving, the danger did not vanish. Rocks loosened by the tremors could fall long after the quake. Cracks in the ground could widen without warning. They treated the aftermath with the same caution they applied to the event itself. Stepping too close to a fissure could mean falling into darkness. Touching an unstable boulder could invite another collapse. They walked carefully, knowing that the earth did not always finish its violence quickly. Their reactions may seem primal, but they were effective. They survived by accepting how small they were in comparison to the forces beneath them. They did not pretend to understand why the earth shook. They did not seek explanations or comfort. They only sought distance, breath, and time to move, time to react, time to live. Sometimes I think their knowledge of danger was clearer than ours, because they never believed the world was stable to begin with. They escaped because their instinct outran the trembling beneath their feet. Yet some quakes hid their strength until the final moment of collapse. Somewhere under the cracked soil, deeper forces waited for another chance to tear the ground open. Floods were among the few dangers that struck with almost no mercy. The land could look calm, the sky could appear harmless, and the air could feel soft against the skin. Yet beneath that quiet surface, water gathered strength in distant places where no one could see it. For people who lived close to valleys and stream beds, the most terrifying part of a flood was not the water itself, but how silently it prepared its arrival. They learned to read the earliest changes because those changes were the only warnings they ever received. The first sign was usually in the water's color. A clear stream turning cloudy meant something upstream had begun to break apart soil roots and rocks. The water thickened, shifting from pale brown to a deeper, heavier shade. It moved differently too, as though pulled by a force too strong to resist. Those who noticed this did not wait. They stepped back, scanning the banks for anything unusual. People who ignored that change even once rarely survived to ignore it again. It is strangely sobering that what looked like a small color change often carried more danger than any predator they faced. Sound carried warnings as well. Before the flood itself appeared a distant grinding noise echoed through the valley. It was the sound of stones being pushed, rolled, and crushed against each other under the weight of water still hidden from sight. The noise did not resemble wind or animals. It had a deeper, heavier quality, a voice of the land being torn apart. Hunters returning home often froze when they heard it, knowing that the flood traveled faster than they could run. That grinding rumble meant death was moving toward them long before the first surge of water arrived. They taught children to listen for this sound at night, when darkness made everything uncertain. A faint shift in the flow of water, a single rock tumbling unnaturally, or the sudden quieting of insects near a stream. All of these were reasons to wake the group and prepare to climb. Children learned early that fear was not shameful. Fear was information. Those who recognized danger without hesitation were the ones who returned alive. Climbing was their only defense. They did not wait for water to appear, because they knew it could surge forward in a single violent wave that swallowed everything in its path. They climbed even when the land seemed dry. They climbed when their instincts felt wrong. They climbed when elders gave them a single nod or raised hand. High ground was life. Low ground was a risk they did not argue about. If someone today were to compare this to modern flood warnings, it would feel like trusting a heartbeat instead of a siren. But for them, instinct was the only alarm that mattered. The difficulty was not just in climbing, but in choosing where to climb. Loose soil could crumble beneath their feet. Rocks could give way under pressure. Trees offered no safety. They could be uprooted or swept away. So they sought ridges with solid stone slopes that had survived many seasons, or small plateaus carved naturally into the landscape. These places became temporary sanctuaries, where they waited, watching the land below change shape under the force of moving water. When the flood finally arrived, it came violently. Water churned with debris, branches, animal bodies, smooth stones and jagged stones. The speed shocked even those who had seen floods before. The valley filled quickly, erasing paths, hiding dangers beneath swirling foam. For a moment, even the strongest adults felt powerless. The land they walked each day became unrecognizable, reshaped in minutes. And still they did not panic. They observed. They learned. They waited for the water to retreat so they could understand how the world had changed. After the flood passed, the danger was not gone. The ground remained unstable, soaked through and prone to collapse. Hidden pools formed where solid ground used to be. Mudslides followed without warning. They moved cautiously, testing each step, scanning the terrain before descending. Their return to lower ground was not a triumph. It was a necessity. They needed water, shelter, and resources, but they returned with the knowledge that the land had become different, and differences meant new risks. Floods shaped their movement patterns. Camps that seemed safe for months became forbidden after a single storm. They marked dangerous areas, with stones stacked in ways only they understood. They described the sound, the speed, and the path of the flood through gestures and memory. They taught their children not to trust the quiet beauty of riverbanks, not to rest near dry channels, even in drought, and not to mistake still water for harmlessness. Sometimes I think their understanding of water came not from watching it flow, but from watching how easily it could erase everything familiar. They survived by acting before there was proof. They survived by trusting signs others might overlook. They survived by accepting that water, though essential to their lives, could turn into the most unpredictable force they faced. They lived because they climbed before danger revealed itself. Yet some floods hid their approach behind windless nights and silent banks. Beyond the far reaches of their vision, water gathered in silence until the moment it no longer could be ignored. Fire was one of the few forces they feared more than storms. A storm might shatter trees or drench the world with water, but fire moved with intention. It did not simply exist, it pursued. It fed on dry leaves, branches, and the smallest spark of heat until a single flicker grew into a line of flame crawling across the ground. People learned early that fire was not just a tool for warmth and cooking. It was a creature that consumed without hesitation, and those who underestimated it rarely survived long enough to learn differently. The warning signs came in layers. First, the air thickened with a dry sharpness that made breathing feel unfamiliar. Then, the scent of smoke drifted quietly across the land, sometimes so faint that only the oldest members noticed it. Smoke did not need to be visible to be dangerous. Even a thin trace meant something somewhere was burning. People stopped what they were doing and turned their faces toward the wind, their expressions tightening as they tried to understand what direction the danger might approach from. Wind dictated everything. They knew well that running in the same direction as a fire traveled was suicide. Flames moved with the wind's full strength, devouring plants faster than any human could sprint. Instead, they ran against the wind, pushing into it even when dust stung their eyes and the heat pressed hard against their skin. Moving against the wind meant moving away from the fire's path, away from the invisible current that carried embers and heat. It is bleakly impressive how they understood the behavior of fire long before anyone began to study it. Their clothing seemed more urgent. Hides and furs were useful for warmth, but they ignited easily when exposed to sparks. When fire caught the edge of a garment, they threw themselves onto dirt or sand, smothering the flames with whatever ground was beneath them. Rolling was not a technique they invented formally. It was instinct formed from watching others survive. They pressed their bodies low, smothering embers with handfuls of earth. The smell of burning hair or fabric was common in these moments, but the alternative was far worse. When the fire spread too quickly, they abandoned everything. Tools, stored food and shelters had no value compared to the speed of flame. They moved toward open land, bare soil, rocky clearings, and areas stripped of dense vegetation by previous burns. These patches of emptiness became islands of safety in a sea of danger. Fire could not leap across stone as easily as it consumed brush. The people memorized these safe zones, treating them as markers on a map, invisible to anyone but themselves. If one compares their escape strategies to modern wildfire training, the resemblance is unsettlingly close. Children learned to read fire not through lectures, but through urgency. They watched adults study wind shifts, head tilts, and the sudden silence that fell over the group when the danger grew nearer. They learned that when the wind warmed suddenly, when animals fled erratically, or when ash drifted like snow, it was time to run. Children were placed at the front of the escape line, so adults could push them forward if they slowed. Fear did not scatter them. It bound them tightly. The forest itself told stories of fire. Charred trunks stood like monuments to past disasters, reminders that the land remembered what people could not always put into words. These blackened trees marked old scars from previous burns, showing how far fire had reached, how high the flames had risen, and how long the heat had lingered. People used these clues to understand which direction the fire might move next. They avoided areas thick with dry brush, understanding that the fire fed hungrily on such places. The hardest decisions were made when someone lagged. Smoke made breathing difficult. Heat drained strength quickly. When a family member stumbled, another grabbed them by the arm and dragged them forward, sometimes against their will. Leaving someone behind was unthinkable, yet running too slowly risked the entire group. They balanced survival with responsibility, though survival sometimes won. The fire did not negotiate, and neither could they. The sound of an approaching blaze was unmistakable. It was not a single noise, but a layered chorus, crackling branches, snapping roots, and the low roar of heat expanding through the air. The sound grew louder, with every heartbeat chasing them, even when they could not yet see the flames. When the fire appeared, it came like a wall of light, bright enough to distort the shapes of trees and rocks. For a moment everything looked unreal, as though the world had been replaced by a trembling haze. Once they reached safety, they sat, quietly exhausted, their chests rising sharply as they breathed in the cooler air. They watched the flames carve through the forest, sometimes for hours, until the fire consumed all it wanted. Only after it died did they begin searching the perimeter, checking whether it had altered the landscape in ways that required them to change their movement routes. Fire reshaped the world, just as water did. The ground-charred plants vanished, and animals migrated, leaving the land strange and unfamiliar. They treated surviving a fire not as a triumph, but as relief. They knew another blaze would come eventually, sparked by lightning, drought, or the smallest ember carried on the wind. The memory of each escape became a lesson, another rule woven into their understanding of the land. They stayed alive because they ran against the fire's breath instead of letting it pull them in. Yet even the safest open ground could fail when heat drifted unpredictably across dry soil. Far beyond their cleared refuge, new flames formed quietly, waiting for a wind strong enough to bring them forward. Strength meant very little in the world the early humans inhabited. Muscles could not stop storms, and bravery could not hold back fire or rising water. What shaped survival was something quieter, something most predators could not see: the ability to notice, remember, and react before danger completed its arrival. Those who lived longest were not the boldest or the strongest. They were the ones who paid attention when others dismissed the smallest signs. They carried the weight of past tragedies in their minds, using memories as shields against the next disaster. Observation became a necessity woven into daily life. People noticed how insects vanished hours before a storm, how birds circled nervously when the wind shifted, how the earth felt different beneath their feet moments before trembling. They memorized sounds, soft cracks, distant rumbling, the strange silence that came when animals fell quiet all at once. These were not guesses or instincts inherited magically. They were lessons earned through blood, passed from those who died to those who watched carefully enough to understand what those deaths meant. Children learned early that survival depended on more than strength. They watched elders studying the sky with a seriousness that needed no explanation. They felt adults tense when the air thickened in unusual ways. They followed without questioning when the group changed course abruptly, even when no visible threat justified the movement. This obedience came not from fear but from trust. Trust that the elders remembered what the younger ones did not yet know. It is almost darkly humorous that their greatest advantage was not power, but a kind of constant paranoia sharpened into skill. Memory worked like an invisible map. It recorded where floods had taken lives, where fires had burned uncontrollably, and where earthquakes had left cracks hidden beneath loose soil. These places were not marked by carvings or stacks of stones. They were marked in the minds of the group, recalled at crucial moments, when choosing where to walk, where to sleep, and where not to return. Someone would point toward a valley and simply shake their head. No explanation followed, only silence heavy with the understanding that someone long ago had died there for a reason. Survival meant remembering the smallest details. A certain shade of cloud meant lightning. A certain shape in the flow of water meant the start of a flood. A certain vibration in the ground meant danger that could strike faster than any escape path allowed. People did not debate these interpretations. They moved the moment memory told them to move. If one were to compare this to modern reliance on data and reports, it would feel like a world where a single human breath replaced an entire warning system. But those breaths saved more lives than technology ever could in such a raw landscape. Those who failed to observe or recall rarely survived long. A hunter who ignored shifting wind might walk straight into the path of a spreading fire. A child who lingered too close to unstable riverbanks could disappear beneath muddy water before anyone noticed. A traveler who slept at the base of a cliff might never wake after the earth gave way. These losses carved themselves into the memories of those who witnessed them. In this way, tragedies became guides shaping behavior long after grief faded. Elders held the heaviest burden. Their minds carried generations of disaster not through storytelling alone but through lived experience. They had felt tremors before shelters collapsed, smelled smoke before fire was visible, and heard the strange hollow quiet before the ground split open. Their decisions often made little sense to younger members, but the group followed anyway. Elders knew the price of doubt. They had buried too many people to risk hesitation. Strength still had its place, but only as a tool. A strong arm could lift debris, but it could not sense the tremor beneath it. A powerful runner could flee quickly, but speed meant nothing if they ran toward the danger instead of away from it. Those who relied solely on physical power often died first because they underestimated the world around them. The land favored those who listened. The sky favored those who watched. Life favored those who remembered. Sometimes the group faced moments that tested even their best judgment. Signs were unclear. Contradictions appeared, and the land behaved unpredictably. In these times, memory worked like a compass, pointing to choices that felt safer than others. When a storm approached without the usual signals, the oldest members scanned the horizon with tight jaws, pulling younger ones closer. When distant sounds resembled neither wind nor water, they gathered their belongings immediately. Their caution looked excessive, yet it saved them again and again. What bound the group together was understanding that survival required cooperation, not heroism. A single person could not watch every direction at once, but a group could. One person heard the shift in wind, another noticed movement in the trees, and another felt the ground tremble. Information flowed rapidly, silently through gestures and glances. They lived as one organism, responding to threats that often arrived without warning. Sometimes I think their survival had less to do with instinct and more to do with the sorrow of those they had watched disappear. Their memories built a path the living could follow. They endured because they remembered what the world tried to erase. Yet memory alone could not shield them from dangers that changed without pattern. In the quiet spaces between disasters, a new threat gathered itself, waiting for those who looked away. Food did not disappear only when people ate it. It disappeared when rain fell too heavily, when storms swept through their shelters, when animals searched for anything edible during hard seasons, and when heat spoiled what they tried to keep. Survival depended not just on finding food, but on keeping it from vanishing in all these ways. Protecting food was as essential as hunting or gathering itself, and those who failed to do so rarely endured more than a few harsh cycles of weather. They learned early that cold earth was a safer storage than open air. When meat was brought back from a hunt, it was never left lying on the ground. They dug shallow pits in shaded soil places where sunlight did not reach, and where the wind stayed cool. The earth became a shield, slowing the rot that arrived quickly in warm climates. Each burial site was chosen carefully away from riverbanks that might flood away from animal paths, and away from the softer ground that collapsed after heavy rain. The meat placed there was packed tightly, covered with layers of soil and stone to prevent scavengers from digging through. Seeds and dry grains demanded different protection. They were stored above ground, tied in leather pouches, and hung high, sometimes on branches, sometimes on simple wooden frames built for no other purpose. These pouches kept the food from moisture rising from the earth, and from insects that would eat through anything left within reach. They swayed quietly in the wind like strange ornaments, whose value only those living understood. It is brutally practical how they treated every seed as a promise rather than a possession. Keeping the fire alive was part of the same responsibility. Without fire stored, food spoiled too quickly. Smoke, hardened meat dried its surface and slowed the growth of mold that thrived in damp conditions. Flames were not allowed to die, especially during storms. Someone always sat near the embers, feeding small sticks when necessary, protecting the pit from rain with stones or hides. Fire was more than light or warmth. It was a barrier against decay. If one thinks of fire now as comfort, they once thought of it as their only shield against hunger, creeping silently into their shelters. When disasters approached, protecting food became even more important than protecting tools. Tools could be remade, food could not. Before storms, they retrieved buried stores and moved them to higher ground. Before floods, they placed stones over pits so the water would not wash everything away. Before earthquakes, they shifted pouches away from cliffs or hollow trees that might collapse. These steps were performed without hesitation because they had already witnessed what happened when forgotten food spoiled at the wrong time. Hunger arrived quickly, and it arrived cruelly. Animals presented a different challenge. Wolves, wildcats, and smaller creatures like foxes or rodents could smell buried meat from far distances. To prevent nighttime losses, they placed thorny branches over burial mounds and scattered ash around them, ash that masked the scent. Some groups even camped close to their storage sites during dangerous seasons, forming a living perimeter around the food. They understood that once an animal found the source, it would return each night unless the people moved entirely. Spoilage was another invisible enemy. During long rains, humidity crept into even the tightest pouches. Dry seeds clumped together. The meat softened too soon. They checked storage constantly, running their fingers across surfaces to feel shifts in texture, pressing lightly to sense hidden moisture. They removed damaged parts quickly, sometimes cutting away half of a stored piece just to prevent the rest from rotting. Waste was painful, but allowing rot to spread was far worse. People who guarded food were rarely the hunters. They were the watchers, those who stayed behind, those who listened to the weather, those who learned to recognize unusual changes in smell or air. Their work did not involve speed or strength. It required care, patience, and vigilance. Losing food meant losing time, losing options, losing lives. In this way, protecting food became a form of protecting the future. Sometimes I think they carried their hope inside those small pouches suspended above the ground like fragile pieces of tomorrow. During extremely harsh seasons, they rationed with severity. A handful of seeds had to last for weeks. A piece of dried meat was cut into portions, too small to satisfy hunger, but large enough to maintain life. They watched children closely, ensuring none wandered to storage pits, and tried to take more than allowed. They also watched adults, especially those who struggled with hunger in ways that clouded judgment. After the disasters passed, they checked their stores before checking the damage to shelters. Food came first because without it, rebuilding meant nothing. If the pits flooded, they dug new ones. If pouches tore, they patched them with rawhide. If the meat spoiled, they headed into the wilderness earlier than planned, risking danger because waiting meant starvation. Every decision circled back to food. In this world, hunger was not a distant fear. It stood close, waiting for a single mistake. Protecting food meant pushing that shadow away for another day. They built their routines around this fragile balance, knowing disaster could erase months of preparation in a single night. They survived because food was guarded with the same urgency as life itself. Yet even the best prepared stores could vanish when storms shifted without warning. Somewhere beyond their shelters, the land changed again, shaping the next struggle before they felt it coming. Shelter was never simply a place to sleep. It was a fragile barrier between the body and a world that did not care whether people survived the night. Rain could drown a fire, wind could tear apart a roof made from branches, and cold ground could drain warmth faster than hunger drained strength. Those who lived long understood that even a small mistake in building a shelter could cost lives when storms moved unpredictably across the land. The first rule was to break the wind. Wind carried rain sideways, pushed smoke into their eyes, and stripped warmth from skin. To counter it, they stacked stones carefully along one side of their shelter, forming a crude but effective wall. The stones were not chosen at random. They were selected for their weight and shape, fitting together in a way that reduced gaps. Over time, these stone barriers resembled low fortifications, crude but dependable. When storms came, the people crouched behind them, feeling the wind pass overhead, rather than slicing through their bodies. The ground beneath them mattered as much as the walls around them. Sleeping directly on dirt invited cold to seep slowly upward, numbing limbs and weakening the body long before morning. So they laid out animal hides, thick, layered, and sometimes even lined with dried grass. These hides acted as insulation, preventing moisture from creeping upward and turning the shelter into a pit of dampness. It is strangely methodical how they learned to fight the earth's cold by borrowing warmth from the bodies of animals they once hunted. Roofs were the most difficult. A poorly built roof collapsed under the weight of water, soaked their belongings, and extinguished their fire before they even realized the structure had failed. They built roofs in the shape of triangles, letting water slide off instead of collecting. Long branches formed the frame, while leaves, grasses, and thin strips of bark created a surface that allowed rain to run down instead of through. The simplicity of the design did not diminish its importance. The angled roof often determined whether they greeted the morning dry and alive, or soaked and shivering. During heavy storms, the sound inside the shelter changed. Raindrops slapped against leaves, wind rattled branches, and water gathered in small runnels outside. They listened carefully to these sounds, recognizing the subtle warning signals when a structure weakened under pressure. A shift in tone meant a branch had bent too far. A rhythmic drip inside the shelter meant a leak had formed. They reacted quickly, reinforcing the roof, adjusting hides, or adding more stones, because hesitation invited collapse. Fire added another complication. They needed it to survive the cold nights, but fire under a poorly constructed roof was dangerous. Smoke accumulated quickly, making breathing difficult. They left small openings at the top of the shelter to let smoke escape, watching the shape of the rising plume to judge whether the wind outside had shifted. Smoke that failed to rise meant danger. A storm approaching, a leak above, or a wind change that might push embers toward the walls. If one imagines modern houses with solid walls and sealed windows, their shelters feel like a negotiation between survival and surrender, held together by instinct and memory. Animals also sought shelter during storms. Some came harmlessly drawn to warmth or the scent of food. Others came hungry. For this reason, they positioned their shelters near rocky outcrops or natural barriers. They rarely slept on open ground during rainy seasons. Openness meant exposure, and exposure meant weakness, which invited predators. If an animal approached, the stone windbreak doubled as a shield, buying enough time to defend themselves or flee. Even the placement of their shelters followed unwritten rules that had been learned over generations. They built slightly above ground, but not on steep slopes. high enough to avoid flooding, low enough to resist strong winds. They avoided valleys that funneled storms and ridges that caught lightning. They observed where water collected naturally and where the earth remained firm after days of rain. These decisions, subtle and silent, determined survival long before the storm clouds appeared. When lightning struck nearby, they stayed low, their bodies pressed against hides and cold ground. Thunder shook the earth in ways that reminded them of distant earthquakes. Children trembled, elders closed their eyes, measuring the rhythm of thunder to judge how close the storm was moving. In the darkness, the shelter felt both protective and fragile, a reminder that they lived between forces far greater than themselves. After the storms passed, assessing damage was nearly a ritual. They walked the perimeter, checking whether wind had shifted stones, whether hides had absorbed too much moisture, and whether branches had cracked unseen. They patched weaknesses immediately, because they knew the next storm rarely waited long. Their shelters evolved constantly, shaped by weather and memory, rebuilt again and again in response to whatever nature destroyed. There was no moment when they declared a shelter complete. Completion did not exist. It was only safe until the next dark cloud appeared on the horizon. They managed to endure each storm by shaping walls, roofs, and floors to resist the world's indifference. Yet even the strongest shelters could betray them when wind carved new paths across the land. Far beyond their last fire, another storm prepared itself, gathering strength where no one could yet see it. Cold was not just a season for them, it was an opponent. It pressed against the skin, seeped into bone, and settled in the chest like a slow weight. Snow arrived quietly, at first a few flakes drifting through the air, but soon it covered the land, burying paths, hiding stones, and transforming familiar ground into a pale desert that drained strength from anyone who walked too far. The harshest cold did not kill swiftly. It waited. It wore people down breath by breath until movement slowed and judgment blurred. During these months, warmth became the most valuable thing they possessed. They slept close together, bodies lined tightly, arms and legs intertwined, not out of affection but necessity. Sharing body heat meant sharing survival. Children were placed in the center of these clusters, their small bodies shielded by the adults around them. Elders stayed closer to the edges, taking on more exposure because they understood the price of cold better than anyone. Their breath rose in thin, fragile clouds that disappeared quickly, swallowed by air too bitter to hold warmth. Fire was both a lifeline and a danger. Inside caves or shelters, flames offered enough heat to keep circulation alive, but fire consumed oxygen just as easily. They learned to keep an opening at the top of the cave or near the entry, allowing smoke to escape and air to flow. Too small an opening meant suffocation. Too large meant losing precious heat. They judged this balance not by measurement, but by watching how smoke curled, how it clung to the ceiling, how their breathing changed. It is grimly impressive how they managed fire with more precision than many who later studied it. Animal hides became armor against the cold. They wrapped themselves in layers, sometimes 3 or 4 thick each layer, trapping air between fibers. This trapped air acted as insulation, holding warmth near the skin and preventing cold from sinking deeper. Over time, hides stiffened from frost, and use becoming heavy, but weight mattered far less than protection. They rubbed animal fat over their skin as well. The grease created a barrier, slowing heat loss and shielding exposed areas. The smell lingered, but no one cared. Smell meant nothing compared to the threat of freezing limbs. Traveling through deep snow required more than endurance. Footsteps vanished, quickly erased by wind or new snowfall, making direction uncertain. People watched the sky during rare, clear moments, using the sun's position or familiar landmarks barely visible through the white haze. Walking alone was unthinkable. The cold numbed the mind long before the body gave in, making shared awareness essential. One person noticed when another slowed. One recognized the early signs of frostbite, skin turning pale and movements growing clumsy. They stopped immediately, warming frozen fingers under hides, rubbing circulation back into stiff limbs. Inside their shelters, silence became sharper during winter. Even breathing sounded louder. Conversation faded because opening mouths meant losing warmth. They communicated through gestures, points, nods, and the shifting of shoulders. Children learned this quiet language early, understanding that noise felt wrong when the world outside held so much stillness. Meat dried by earlier fires became brittle, hard to chew. They softened pieces near the flames, passing them carefully between hands. Hunger made them impatient, yet they never lingered too close to the fire. knowing a single spark could ignite their hides. Storms brought a different kind of threat. Snow blew sideways, filling cracks in shelters, choking entryways, and smothering fire pits. They shoveled snow away, using bones or flat stones, desperate to keep the shelter from collapsing under the growing weight. When storms lasted days, the cold deepened into a presence that could be felt even in the darkest corners. People stayed awake in shifts, making sure the fire remained alive, and watching for any sign the roof might give way. Water was difficult too. Ice-covered streams and rivers, forcing them to break through with stones or heavy branches. Even then, water refroze almost immediately, demanding quick cups and quicker drinking. The shock of cold water hammered through their bodies but kept them alive. Dehydration in winter was as deadly as frostbite, though less obvious. They taught children to drink even when they felt no thirst. Predators were surprisingly rare in deep winter. Most retreated into dens, surviving on stored fat. But hunger made some bold. Wolves wandered near shelters drawn by the scent of hides or leftover bones. Their eyes glowed faintly just beyond the light of the fire, patient and watchful. The people tightened their circle, gripping stones or wooden spears, knowing fire kept predators at a distance, but never guaranteed safety. As winter stretched on, time lost meaning. Days blurred into a continuous struggle to stay warm, stay fed, stay awake. Yet they adapted, shaping their routines around cold in ways modern comfort would hardly understand. They accepted discomfort with a level of discipline that the land demanded. Their survival came not from conquering winter, but from enduring it with a stubbornness that matched the relentless season. When the first hints of warmth returned, water dripping from icicles, birds calling faintly, snow thinning on the ground, they felt cautious relief. Winter loosened its grip slowly, and they treated its retreat with suspicion. They had learned too often that warmth could vanish again without warning. They stayed alive by holding close, maintaining fire, and shielding themselves with layers shaped by necessity. Yet even these measures faltered when storms pushed harder than expected. Beyond the dim edges of their refuge, cold gathered in silence, preparing its return with a force they could not fully foresee. Earthquakes did not announce themselves with light or clouds or scent. They arrived from below, silent until the last moment, striking in ways no one fully understood. The ground which people trusted to carry their steps and cradle their shelters sometimes shifted like a living thing. It trembled, split or sank without warning, swallowing stones, trees, and occasionally those unfortunate enough to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. To live in such a world meant accepting that danger did not always come from what the eyes could see. They had no theories to explain why the earth behaved this way. They only had memories, fragmented, fearful, passed in whispers from one generation to the next. People remembered the shock of solid ground, turning fluid beneath their feet, the sudden crack that opened where a foot had just been lifted, the awful silence that followed as dust drifted from the ceiling of a cave. It is unsettling to realize how they survived, not through knowledge, but through repetition of fear, turned into practical caution. The earliest sign was often the stillness. Animals that usually moved or called out suddenly fell quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. People learned to read this unnatural pause as a warning. A second later, vibrations rippled beneath them, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent enough to knock them off their feet. They moved instinctively, rushing toward open land, away from caves, cliffs, or heavy rocks that could collapse. Children were pulled forward, elders pushed from behind, all scrambling to escape before the trembling grew stronger. Inside caves, danger multiplied. Stones loosened from above, sometimes dropping seconds before the main shaking began. People kept sleeping areas away from the deepest parts of the caves, choosing spots where they could flee quickly if needed. Nights were the worst. Waking to shaking earth meant racing blindly toward the exit, while dust clouded the air. Breathing became difficult as fine particles filled noses and throats. But hesitation was fatal. The earth did not stop because someone needed more time. The ground sometimes split open. These sudden crevices varied in size, some barely a hand's width, others wide enough to swallow a body whole. Stories told of hunters who vanished without any sound, the earth closing behind them as if nothing had happened. Such tales were repeated, not as exaggerations, but as warnings. When someone pointed toward a certain stretch of land and refused to walk there, the group obeyed. The earth remembered tragedy, even when people struggled to put it into words. After an earthquake, the landscape changed in ways that made familiar paths dangerous. Rocks shifted, soil loosened. Rivers diverted, slightly changing their courses by just enough to confuse navigation. People moved cautiously in these moments, using sticks to prod uncertain ground. Children were instructed to walk only where adults walked, stepping in the same prints. Even a short walk to fetch water required vigilance. The trembling did not always come alone. Sometimes it was followed by falling rocks, landslides, or sudden collapses of hillside earth. A hillside that had been stable for years could break apart within seconds, burying everything beneath it. People learned to avoid camping near slopes during seasons when the ground felt softer, especially after heavy rains. They did not need detailed reasoning. They had memory, and memory was enough to dictate caution. Silence became both a warning and an aftermath. Before a tremor, the world went quiet. After a tremor, silence returned heavier than before. The absence of sound felt like the earth holding its breath. People waited in this stillness, unsure if another shaking would follow. Sometimes the second tremor was stronger than the first, catching those who relaxed too quickly. They stayed alert. Fire-dimmed belongings gathered ready to flee again. They developed simple practices that increased their odds of survival. Sleeping with tools nearby ensured they could cut or dig if trapped. Keeping children closer at night meant pulling them out quickly if the shelter collapsed. Choosing campsites on flat, stable ground reduced the risk of fissures forming beneath them. These were not guarantees. The earth shifted regardless of preparation. But the small changes in behavior made enough difference to be repeated generation after generation. After the danger passed, people studied the new cracks in the land. They traced the edges, measured their depth with branches, and avoided these places for seasons at a time. Some cracks exhaled faint warmth. Others revealed unexpected pockets of gas, which frightened them further. They offered small tokens, stones, bones, or pieces of wood near the edges, not as worship, but as a gesture of respect toward forces they could not see. In their minds, the earth was unpredictable, a presence capable of sudden violence. They feared storms, but storms gave signals. They feared predators, but predators could be fought. Earthquakes belonged to a different category entirely, threats that rose from beneath their feet invisible until they struck indifferent to strength or skill. Yet they survived because they learned to move without questioning why. They accepted that the world could shift at any moment and built their habits around that truth. There was bravery in their caution, a quiet toughness shaped by countless escapes and countless losses. They stayed alive by trusting the signs their bodies felt long before their minds understood. Yet even trust could falter when the ground shifted faster than memory allowed. Just beyond the reach of their awareness, the earth prepared its next fracture, waiting for those who stepped without listening. Drought crept across the land without sound. There was no sudden shift, no storm to warn them, no trembling earth to force them into motion. It began quietly: streams, thinning puddles, shrinking soil cracking under the weight of footsteps. Plants wilted, animals moved restlessly, and the air grew heavy with dust that settled into every breath. Hunger was difficult, but thirst stripped strength faster, hollowing the body from within. Water became not a resource, but a question that followed them everywhere. Their survival depended on watching how the world reacted to the heat. People paid close attention to the movements of animals. Tracks left in soft soil told stories about where water might still exist. Fresh footprints meant an animal had passed recently, and when many sets of tracks converged in the same direction, the people followed. Rarely did animals wander without purpose during drought. They traveled toward whatever remaining water they sensed, whether it was a shrinking pool or a hidden spring. It is strangely pragmatic that they relied more on animals' instincts than on their own understanding of the land. Sometimes the prints led to small depressions, where water collected briefly after rare rainfall. These shallow pools evaporated quickly under the sun, but even a mouthful of muddy water kept the group alive long enough to continue searching. They cupped their hands, lifting what little they found, carefully treating each drop as something precious. Children watched the adults kneel, dig, and drink with slow deliberation, learning that desperation required patience rather than panic. Vegetation offered another set of clues. Certain plants grew only near underground moisture, thick-rooted shrubs, hardy grasses, or trees with unusually deep roots. The people recognized these species at a glance, understanding they meant water lay hidden beneath the surface. They approached such plants with caution, touching the leaves, pressing fingers against the soil to feel traces of coolness. When the ground felt promising, they dug. Digging was slow, exhausting labor. The sun beat down relentlessly. Dust filled the air, turning sweat into streaks of mud on their skin. They used sharpened sticks, bones, or stones to loosen the soil scooping handfuls of earth away until the dirt felt slightly damp. Sometimes water seeped upward in thin threads, barely enough to collect. Other times their digging revealed nothing but dry soil layered beneath dry soil. Failure was common, but they dug again at a different spot, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant surrendering to thirst. Tree roots held another secret. At the base of large trees, moisture lingered longer than in exposed soil. People learned to dig near the roots, scraping away dirt until water pooled slowly in the hollow they formed. This water tasted of earth and leaves, but it kept them alive. They drank cautiously, passing small portions to children and elders first. Even in scarcity, they preserved ritual. Care for the weakest was not a burden, but a necessity for the group's survival. Animals themselves guided tracks. Their behavior changed dramatically during the drought. Birds flew lower, scanning the ground for insects near water sources. Herd animals moved in single file, forming narrow paths carved into dry soil. Even predators traveled with a strange focus, following the same invisible lines that led everything else toward the possibility of water. The people observed this with quiet intensity, knowing predators were less dangerous than thirst. In the worst periods, when days passed without any success, the group traveled at night. The heat made daytime movement unbearable, draining strength before any progress could be made. Night travel offered cooler air, allowing them to follow animal paths for longer distances. But darkness also hid dangers, uneven ground predators, or cracks in the earth left behind by earlier droughts. Still, they moved, driven by the simple truth that water seldom came to those who stayed still. When they finally found a reliable source, a partially sheltered pool, a slow dripping rock face, or a deep spring relief, came not as celebration, but as quiet endurance. They filled containers made of leather or carved bone, storing as much as they could carry. They let children drink first, then elders, then adults. No one drank too quickly, even when thirst clawed at their throats. Too much water after long deprivation brought sickness. They paced themselves, understanding that survival required patience, even in moments of abundance. Each discovery became a memory. They marked routes in their minds, noting where certain plants grew, where animal paths converged, and where the ground offered resistance or softness when digging. This internal map passed from generation to generation, shaped not by writing, but by repetition. Knowledge of water meant life, and forgetting meant death. Drought taught them that the land could be both generous and merciless. The same ground that held water one season might offer nothing the next. Instinct, observation, and resilience became intertwined, guiding their search for the one resource they could not replace. They endured because they followed the signs left behind by creatures who sensed water more clearly than they did. Yet even the sharpest eyes failed when the drought deepened into something the land itself seemed to fear. Beyond the fading tracks and withering plants, a harsher dryness stirred, shaping the next test they would face without warning. After a disaster, the land never looked the same. Floods scraped away familiar paths, carving new channels where none existed before. Fires left behind blackened soil, and hollow trees standing like burnt ribs. Even earthquakes reshaped the edges of valleys, tilting stones in strange angles that made old shelters useless. The people did not linger in these changed landscapes. They knew the land needed time to settle, and staying meant risking another unseen danger. So they gathered their belongings, what little remained, and moved again. Shifting their living space was not a decision made slowly. It happened with a kind of quiet urgency shaped by memory. Flooded ground hid pockets of mud deep enough to trap ankles or swallow feet. Burned forests held weakened trees that could collapse without warning. Even when disaster seemed finished, its echoes remained. People stepped carefully, testing the earth with sticks, searching for stability before taking each step. They understood that survival depended not on staying where they had been safe before, but on recognizing that the land no longer promised safety. One of the first rules was avoiding places where animals had died. The bodies attracted insects quickly, and the insects brought disease. The stench carried a warning sharper than any words. Children were taught never to approach such areas, and adults kept their distance even when scavengers already picked at the remains. Death spread easily in warm climates, and they had seen enough sickness after past disasters to know that curiosity was dangerous. It is grimly practical that they treated the presence of dead animals not as a tragedy, but as a sign to turn away immediately. Finding higher ground became a priority. Places above the reach of receding water were safer, less likely to collapse, and offered enough visibility to assess threats approaching from below. Hillsides held risks, but elevated flat areas, plateaus, ridges, or even natural shelves of stone gave them the certainty that the next flood would not sweep them away without warning. They watched how sunlight fell across these areas, choosing places that dried quickly after rain. Dampness led to sickness. Dry ground preserved life. Light mattered too. They avoided dark, confined spaces after disasters. Shadows concealed hazards, deep cracks, unstable rocks, and hidden pools of foul water. Bright areas allowed them to study the ground, to see where Earth had shifted, to check for new animal tracks or signs of returning predators. Sunlight also lifted their spirits slightly, though this was rarely spoken aloud. In the wake of destruction, warmth and clarity felt like small assurances that the world had not entirely turned against them. Rebuilding shelters was an act of necessity rather than hope. They began by clearing debris, pushing aside burnt wood or shifting loose stones. Each shelter rose slowly, layer by layer, built with more caution than the last. People remembered how their previous shelters had failed, where the wind had broken through, where water had seeped in, where the roof had collapsed. Their new structures reflected this memory, shaped by mistakes carved deep into their minds. If one compares their rebuilding to modern reconstruction, the difference lies only in tools, not in the weight of fear guiding each decision. They also checked for signs that the disaster might return. After floods, they examined the sky for lingering storm clouds, watching how fast the river withdrew. After fires, they touched stones to feel whether hidden embers remained. After earthquakes, they waited for smaller tremors, tracking their frequency. These acts were not rituals. They were practical responses learned from moments when people rebuilt too early, only to face the same danger again. As they moved through the ruined land, silence followed them. No insects were buzzing, no birds calling, no rustling in the bushes. Nature itself seemed hesitant to return. This emptiness amplified every sound they made: footsteps on broken branches, stones scraping against each other, breath drawn slowly in the cold air. Children clung to adults, sensing danger, even when they did not fully understand it. The absence of life meant the land had not healed. Selecting a new place to settle meant observing how the world behaved there. They watched how the wind moved across the ground, how shadows shifted, how the air smelled at different times of day. Water sources needed to be nearby, but not threatening. Trees needed to be present, but not unstable. Rocks needed to be large enough to offer shelter, but not fractured by recent tremors. They treated each potential site like a question. Would it protect them or betray them? Once the decision was made, they settled as a group, working without speaking much. Fires were lit carefully, as if flame itself needed reassurance. Hides were laid out, stones stacked, and branches chosen for their strength rather than convenience. Slowly the signs of life returned: movement, warmth, the quiet rise and fall of breathing inside newly formed shelters. Yet even in these moments of rebuilding, caution remained close. Disasters left marks not only on the land but on the people themselves. They carried those marks forward, shaping every choice. They survived by leaving behind places that no longer promised safety. Yet even new ground could hide dangers disguised by light and silence. At the far edge of their quiet refuge, the land trembled faintly, hinting at a shift they were not prepared to face. Fire was the closest thing they had to certainty. In a world ruled by storms, predators, and shifting earth, flame offered something steady: light at night, warmth against cold, protection from creatures that prowled the darkness. But fire never existed on its own. It demanded care, attention, and a kind of constant vigilance. Without that, it vanished quickly, leaving nothing but cold ash and a sense of vulnerability that seeped into every breath. They guarded fire more carefully than food. Food could be hunted again. Fire once lost meant hours of work or a dangerous journey to find natural sparks from lightning-struck trees. They used stones to strike against one another, producing faint sparks that landed on dried grass or thin strips of bark. These sparks were small, weak, and easily extinguished by the wind. It required patience, a steady hand, and the willingness to endure failure after failure until the flame finally appeared. It is almost unsettling how keeping fire alive mattered more than resting, eating, or sometimes even grieving. Once fire existed, it became a responsibility shared by everyone in the group. Someone always watched over it, feeding it gently with dry twigs or thicker branches as the flame grew stronger. Children sat near it to warm their hands, but they also learned quickly that fire could turn on them if mishandled. They respected its heat the same way they respected the unpredictability of storms. Fire was a companion, but a dangerous one. To protect fire from the weather, they built shallow pits surrounded by stones. The stones absorbed heat, allowing the fire to last longer, even when the wind tried to steal it. During rain, they shielded the pit, with hides stretched overhead, letting smoke escape through small openings. Smoke meant life. If smoke faded suddenly, it meant the flame was struggling. People rushed toward it, then fanning, feeding, coaxing it back into a steady glow. Keeping the fire alive during travel required different methods. They carried embers wrapped in ash, stored inside small leather pouches or clay containers when available. The ash insulated the embers, keeping them warm for hours, sometimes even days. These glowing remnants were not hot enough to burn skin, but warm enough to spark new flames when placed onto dry tinder. Losing such a pouch was treated almost like losing a person, because without it starting over meant risking exposure to cold or predators while gathering materials. At night, fire served as their wall against the unseen. Predators, wolves, large cats, and other nocturnal hunters hesitated at its glow. Even the scent of smoke made some creatures avoid the campsite entirely. People positioned their sleeping areas around the fire in a loose circle, the light falling gently across their bodies. They slept lightly, knowing fire needed attention long before dawn. Someone always stirred to add more wood, checking the edges to ensure sparks did not drift into the hides or nearby brush. Fire shaped their meals too. Raw meat carries diseases, especially after disasters or during wet seasons. Fire made food safer, tougher, and more enduring. Smoking meat over low flames produced strips that lasted weeks, essential during long journeys. They ate slowly, not out of ritual, but because fire-cooked food offered a rare comfort in a world where most things felt hostile. The warmth slid down their throats, giving them a momentary sense of strength that cold water or raw plants never offered. Fire also played a role in their minds. Sitting near it meant feeling safe enough to think, to breathe evenly, to let exhaustion settle instead of fighting it. Flame provided a boundary against darkness, which carried its own threats, not just predators, but the weight of uncertainty. When the land around them shifted or changed after a disaster, fire remained familiar. It flickered the same way, cracked the same way, and warmed the same way no matter where they were. But fire could also betray them. Sparks drifting into dry leaves could begin a blaze that spread faster than they could run. An abandoned ember left near the brush could ignite when they least expected it. They had witnessed the aftermath of such accidents: burned ground, missing members, and a sense of guilt that stayed with the survivors. These memories taught them caution. Fire was never left unattended, not even for a moment. Children learned to treat fire with respect bordering on fear. They watched adults handle embers carefully, blow gently on tinder, scrape ash aside with deliberate movements. They mimicked these motions before they understood them. The rhythm of tending fire became part of their childhood, embedded into their instincts long before they reached adulthood. During harsh, cold fire kept limbs from numbness and breath from freezing in the night air. People pressed close to the heat, turning slowly, so warmth reached every part of their bodies. They recognized the signs of cold creeping too deeply, hands stiffening, lips pale, eyes dulling. Fire restored these signs more effectively than anything else, pulling them back from the edge of danger. The responsibility of guarding the fire did not belong to a single person. It belonged to everyone. Someone fed it, someone watched it, someone protected it during storms, someone carried it in embers when the group moved. This shared burden created a quiet unity as essential as the flame itself. They endured because fire turned fear into light, cold into warmth, and raw survival into something bearable. Yet even fire could fade when the wind rose abruptly and wood burned faster than expected. At the dim boundary of their fragile circle of light, darkness gathered again, preparing to test what they believed they could control. Danger did not always arrive with force. Sometimes it came quietly, riding on shifts of wind so subtle that only those who had lived long in the wild noticed them. For prehistoric people, the wind was not simply air moving across the land. It was a messenger. It carried scent, temperature, silence, and tension. Long before storms formed or predators approached, the wind revealed what the world was preparing to do. Those who listened lived. Those who ignored it did not last long enough to learn twice. Wind rarely lied. When it changed direction abruptly, something had shifted beyond the horizon. Hunters stopped in mid-step, their bodies tensing as the breeze brushed past them from a place it should not have come. Parents gathered the children closer without speaking. Even the youngest members understood the unspoken rule. A sudden change in wind meant the land was about to reveal something dangerous. It is strangely solemn how they trusted the invisible more than anything they could see. Animals sensed these changes before humans did. Birds lifted their heads sharply, their bodies stiffening for a moment before taking flight. Small creatures froze mid-scurry, their whiskers trembling. Larger animals, deer, boar, even predators, shifted their weight uneasily or moved away from open ground. These reactions were warnings people learned to interpret with precision. They understood that animals did not panic without reason. The twitch of an ear, the ruffle of fur, the nervous stamping of hooves were signs sharper than any sound carried by the wind itself. Nights were the most revealing. When the group slept, the world around them fell into predictable patterns: breathing, crackling fire, distant insects. But a sudden shiver from an animal resting nearby could wake even the deepest sleeper. They opened their eyes to darkness and felt the shift before seeing it. The breeze might move differently, colder or warmer, carrying a faint dryness or moisture out of season. They lay still, listening. Their instincts sharpened in ways that came not from fear, but from repetition. Their lives had been shaped by the consequences of ignoring subtle warnings. Silence also signaled danger. When the wind died completely, when leaves stopped moving, when the air felt unnaturally heavy, they knew something was building. Storms often hid behind stillness, gathering strength before rushing forward with violent force. Predators approached silently when the wind favored them. Even earthquakes sometimes proceeded with stopped air, as though the world itself had paused to brace for impact. That silence carried weight. People recognized it like a familiar voice. They moved their camps when the wind felt wrong. No one demanded explanations. Movement was instinctive, a shared understanding. They gathered tools, lifted children, secured embers in ash, and walked until the wind settled again. Sometimes the shift meant nothing immediate: no storm, no predator, no shaking ground. But the choice to move still saved them from unseen hazards: falling branches, flash floods, or predators hunting by scent. If one compares their reactions to modern alarms, the difference is simply that their warning system lived in the air rather than in machines. Hunters depended heavily on wind. Tracking animals required staying downwind so their scent would not alert prey. But staying downwind also meant understanding when scents changed: smoke, rot, unfamiliar musk, drifting toward them. These changes triggered quiet retreats. They returned to camp and reported these shifts not through stories but through gestures. A tilt of the head, a lowered hand, a glance toward the horizon. These gestures were enough. The group understood. The wind even shaped how they built shelters. They observed which direction storms usually approached, from where cliffs broke the force of gales and where valleys funneled dangerous bursts of air. They used this knowledge to angle roofs, position openings, and place fire pits. Mistakes meant cold nights or collapsed structures. Experience taught them to respect the wind as both ally and adversary. Children learned these patterns early. They were taught to stand still, close their eyes, and feel the way the air touched their skin. They learned to identify when the breeze carried moisture or when dust rode on it, indicating a storm or distant movement. Childhood games involved mimicking bird calls or guessing wind direction by watching how the grass leaned. These were not mere play. They were survival lessons disguised as simplicity. In the darkest seasons, the wind became more treacherous. Cold winds stole warmth faster than fire could restore it. Hot winds signaled drought, carrying dust that burned the lungs. Regardless of season, a change meant something had shifted in the rhythm of the land. They responded with vigilance, never assuming they were safe just because the night appeared calm. Some nights felt heavier than others. The wind circled unpredictably, carrying fragmented scents that gave no clear meaning. People lay awake, gripping their hides, waiting for clarity. Sometimes nothing happened. Other times, the danger arrived hours later. A predator prowling near camp, a sudden burst of rain, turning soil into mud, or distant tremors that rolled through the ground. The wind did not give explanations. It simply warned. Living by wind meant accepting uncertainty as a companion. They did not hope the wind would always guide them. They simply knew it often did. And when it didn't, they relied on the heightened awareness that constant fear had carved into their instincts. They survived because the wind whispered truths their eyes could not see. Yet even the clearest warning meant little when danger rose from hidden places with no scent at all. Along the shifting air outside their fragile shelters, another signal gathered quietly, waiting to change everything again. After storms, floods, or fires, danger did not leave with the passing wind. It lingered in quieter forms, hidden in water, soil carcasses, and the stale air that settled over the land. Prehistoric people understood these dangers, not through theory, but through memories shaped by loss. They knew that after nature finished its violent outburst, another enemy often arrived: sickness. The kind that moved silently without sound or warning, creeping through groups until it took whoever was weakest or simply unlucky. Dead animals were always the first sign. A carcass lying too close to their shelter told them the land had changed in ways they could not see. They burned these remains quickly, sometimes without even inspecting them, knowing that leaving them would invite rot insects and sickness. Smoke carried away the danger, or at least they believed it did. It became a ritual of protection, a decision made more on instinct than logic. Yet it kept them alive through seasons, when the world seemed determined to thin them out. It is quietly impressive how they trusted the fire more than they trusted the ground they walked on. Water was the second threat. After floods, pools formed in unpredictable places, clear on the surface but filled with unseen dangers beneath. They learned not to drink from these pools no matter how thirsty they were. Water had to be boiled even if fuel was scarce. They guarded the fire carefully, feeding small sticks until the pot rattled softly. Boiled water tasted flat, but it kept them alive. Children sometimes disobeyed, dipping cupped hands into seemingly harmless puddles, and their punishment came later: fever cramps, weakness that left them unable to stand. Those memories turned into lessons carved deep into the group's habits. They avoided hunting in places where the air smelled wrong. The scent of decay, sour soil, or swarms of flies meant something had died or was dying. They knew sickness often clung to these areas, waiting for those foolish enough to step toward it. Hunters circled wide around such places, refusing to track animals through them. Even predators avoided these spots, and humans took the hint. Nothing good waited in the air that felt thick and heavy. It was a rule simple enough to pass down for countless generations. Food storage became a struggle after disasters. Meat spoiled quickly in warm climates, so they buried it deep in cold soil or hung it high, where animals could not reach it. They checked it daily, watching for signs of rot. Spoiled food smelled different, sweeter, heavier, and even the youngest members learned to turn away from it. Hunger tempted them to take risks, but hunger also killed more slowly than sickness. Between the two dangers, they chose the one they understood better. They treated wounds with extreme caution. After storms, debris was scattered everywhere: sharp branches, stones, bones. A small cut could turn deadly if the skin broke open to the wrong kind of dirt. They washed wounds with boiled water and wrapped them tightly. Infection carried no sound, but it revealed itself gradually through heat swelling and darkened flesh. When it came, they knew the chances of survival were slim. They had no medicines, only the hope that the body would fight. They learned to stay away from stagnant water. Pools that did not move became breeding places for insects that bit and irritated the skin. These bites often became infected, leading to fever or worse. So they drove children away from them, lifting them from the ground with firm hands and steering them away. Stagnant water meant sickness. Flowing water meant life. That was a rule no one questioned. Fire again served as protection. Smoke kept insects away. Heat dried damp clothing. Flames purified tools, bones, and hides. The group gathered around the fire each evening, not for comfort alone, but for safety. The fire circled them in an invisible boundary, marking a line sickness crossed less frequently. If one compares their nightly fire to modern protective systems, the difference is simply that theirs glowed instead of blinking. They stayed alert for unusual animal behavior. Sick animals moved differently, slowly, confused, separated from their groups. Hunters avoided them, leaving them to die naturally. Eating sick meat had never ended well, and those memories lived long after the people who suffered them were gone. Even children pointed out animals that walked strangely. Knowledge passed from generation to generation, in gestures, warnings, and quiet remarks around the fire. Rot carried its own signal: a strange warmth in the air, a heaviness in the chest, the tremble of flies in thick clusters. These signs taught them to relocate quickly. They shifted their shelters to higher ground or into forests, where breezes kept the insects away. Survival meant moving often, especially when sickness lingered. Staying too long in a contaminated space invited death. They washed themselves more carefully after disasters. Mud from floods contained hidden dangers, clinging to skin, hair, and clothing. They rubbed themselves with sand, wiped their bodies with leaves, and rinsed in running water whenever they could. Cleanliness was not a luxury, it was a barrier. They did not need to understand why it worked. They only needed to remember what happened to those who ignored it. Sometimes sickness appeared, even when all precautions were taken. A child coughed through the night. An elder sweated in silence. A hunter's breath grew shallow. They isolated these people, gently placing them in separate shelters so the illness would not spread. It was not cruelty, it was survival. I have always thought that these decisions, though silent, reveal how fragile and determined they truly were. They watched the sky differently after the sickness passed. Every cloud, every breeze, every distant rumble carried meaning. They knew disasters would return, and when they did, sickness would follow behind them like a shadow. They endured because they never forgot. They kept sickness at bay with memory and fear shaped into caution. Yet even caution failed when the land shifted faster than they could react. Just beyond the fading scent of smoke, something waited quietly, gathering its force before touching their world again. They passed knowledge the way they passed fire, slowly, carefully, as though each fragment might be the only barrier between life and disappearance. In the quiet, after storms, or once the ground stopped trembling, the older ones gathered the young where the light reached the walls of the cave. Their breath rose in faint clouds, and their shadows stretched long across the stone, shaping stories that had been told long before anyone present was born. These stories were not meant to entertain. They were meant to anchor memory, to keep fear from scattering into confusion, and to ensure that mistakes were not repeated when the earth sent its warnings again. The elders spoke of thunder that arrived without rain, of cracks in the soil that widened with no sound at all, of winds that turned warm before nightfall and brought destruction by morning. They described each event with careful detail, repeating patterns they had once ignored before learning the price of ignorance. Their voices were steady, but the weight in them could be felt as though every word had been carried through years of walking and watching. They recounted the loss of those who had not sensed danger quickly enough, and the silence that followed long after the storms ended. Children listened, sitting close to stay warm, their eyes following the movements of hands that traced shapes in the air. Shapes meant to represent rivers that once swelled overnight, mountains that shed boulders like loose skin, and skies that shifted from calm to threat without warning. In those gestures, the young learned more than stories. They learned survival. They learned that nothing happened without a sign, even when the sign was too small for untrained senses. They learned that listening to the land mattered as much as listening to the elders. Sound played a central role in this passing of knowledge. The children were taught to distinguish the murmur of distant water from the grinding of stones carried by a sudden surge. They were told to wake immediately when animals stirred in panic, because animals sensed danger long before humans understood it. They learned to notice the faint changes in air pressure, the stillness that settled just before the wind reversed its direction, and the trembling of the ground that preceded larger ruptures. The elders taught them to identify each warning, not through explanation but through repetition, guiding them to feel the patterns rather than merely remember them. Smell, too, became a language of survival. The young learned the scent of wet earth before floods, the bitterness carried by certain plants when storms approached, and the sharp odor released by disturbed soil near fresh cracks. These smells carried messages, and the elders insisted that recognizing them was as crucial as recognizing footsteps or voices. Over time, the children learned to sense danger, even when they could not articulate why. That instinct, shaped by observation, fear, and memory, became their inheritance. To ensure nothing was forgotten, the elders carved symbols onto the stone walls. These carvings were simple yet deliberate spirals for whirlwinds, jagged lines for ground fractures, sloping shapes for water rising too quickly. Each mark told a story, and each story warned of danger that might one day return. Generations could pass, but the stone held memory, even when voices faded. The young were taught to trace these carvings with their fingers, to understand the meanings embedded in each groove, and to commit them to heart, as if they were lessons written in breath rather than stone. These carvings also marked places that carried hidden danger. A particular symbol might signify unstable cliffs, another might denote ground that had collapsed before, and yet another indicated rivers that rose without warning during certain moons. Children grew up knowing these paths not by maps but by memory. They walked with elders who pointed to landmarks bearing marks left decades earlier, sometimes by people who no longer had names. These silent warnings shaped their routes, their shelters, and their choices during migration. Yet the sharing of knowledge was not only about disaster, it was also about trust. By passing these teachings to the young, the elders ensured that the group remained linked across time. Each generation held pieces of memory from those who had come before, and by sharing those pieces, they strengthened the group's resilience. In their world, forgetting meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant disappearance. So the teaching continued night after night, season after season, through cold hunger and uncertainty. The young absorbed the lessons slowly, their senses sharpening with each repetition. They learned to move, not only with their muscles but with awareness, watching the horizon for changes, listening to the groan of shifting earth, and smelling the wind for clues that could mean life or death. In time, they too would become the ones who sat beside the fire, their voices carrying the weight of memories shaped by danger and survival. They carried these lessons like embers, small but steady, guiding their steps with the memory of storms they had never witnessed. Yet even shared wisdom faltered when the land changed faster than the stories could prepare them for. Somewhere within the quiet of their familiar paths, a new threat waited, holding patterns none of them had learned to read. They adapted to shifting landscapes the way animals did, quietly, instinctively, and with a patience sharpened by hunger. When the land changed, they changed with it. Nothing stayed the same for long rivers, cut new paths after storms, forests retreated under heat, and valleys that once held herds became barren, stretches of cracked soil. Survival depended on understanding these movements before empty stomachs turned warning into desperation. For prehistoric groups, hunting was not a single skill, but a shifting arrangement of strategies shaped by the land's unpredictable rhythm. The people watched the animals more closely than they watched the sky. Herds served as living maps of where food remained possible. When the ground dried and plants withered, the herds migrated, sometimes suddenly, leaving behind silence and footprints. The hunters followed, pacing their steps behind the great beasts, reading the bent grass and churned soil to anticipate direction. They knew which animals preferred high plains during colder winds, and which sought valleys when storms threatened. Each shift in movement revealed changes in the earth itself. By following animals that sensed danger early, the hunters gained not only food but warnings about the coming days. Traveling with the herds required constant awareness. The hunters moved lightly, careful not to exhaust themselves before the chase truly began. They tested the wind, checking if their scent drifted toward the animals. They spread out, forming quiet arcs that narrowed only when a moment presented itself. No spear was thrown without certainty. Wasted strength meant vulnerability. The youngest hunters learned by watching how the elders paused, listening for subtle changes in the herd's breathing, or the thump of hooves unevenly spaced, a sign of weakness, injury, or opportunity. When storms passed and waters receded, the rivers changed character entirely. Pools that had not existed days earlier formed in low basins, and fish trapped in these shallow waters became an unexpected gift. Hunters turned to fishing not because it was easier, but because it was faster. Protein gained quickly meant regained strength, allowing them to continue long-distance movement without waiting for hunting luck. They used sharpened sticks, woven traps, and their own hands feeling through murky water for the trembling of scales. Even children participated, wading carefully near the edges to scoop up slower fish that could not escape. Fish from post-flood pools tasted sharp, metallic, and cold, but they sustained them. They dried strips of it over low fires to create a form of preserved food that could be carried for several days. The smell clung to their hair and clothes, following them as they moved on from the flooded grounds. It was not pleasant, but it meant survival, and that alone gave the scent a kind of dignity. The group knew that an animal carcass could feed them once, but fish gathered quickly after storms could sustain them until the herds returned. Still, fresh meat was never enough by itself. The hunters learned early that fat mattered more than muscle when winter approached or when drought lingered. They harvested animal fat with a level of care usually reserved for fire. They stored it in hide pouches sealed tightly to keep insects away. Fat burned slowly and provided warmth when mixed with dried grasses. It also gave their bodies energy when the land yielded nothing else. The elders taught the group to identify which animals offered rich fat reserves and which seasons produced the best yield. They understood that fat was not merely a byproduct, it was a lifeline. The collection of fat required patience. They melted it over low fires, letting it settle before scraping off impurities. The liquid cooled into thick layers that hardened during the night's cold. Children pressed it into small bundles, each wrapped in leaves before being placed inside leather containers. These bundles were carried during migrations, rationed carefully during scarcity, and shared in moments when exhaustion threatened to break the group's unity. Fat preserved strength in ways that meat alone never could. Hunting strategies changed again when landscapes broke apart after environmental disruption. Earthquakes forced herds to shift routes, fires drove them to new valleys, and drought pulled them farther than expected. Hunters developed a sense of timing, learning to predict how long an area would remain habitable for prey. They understood that staying in one place too long meant watching the land turn empty. Movement was the only constant. The group walked at dawn to stay ahead of the heat, and they rested in the shade during midday, conserving energy for evening hunts. Each change in the environment carved new instincts into the collective memory of the hunters. They learned never to rely on a single source of food. They learned that rivers provided fish, only for a short window, after floods that certain plants indicated nearby herds, and that birds circling repeatedly over an area sometimes signaled fresh kills left by larger predators. These clues were not guaranteed, but they increased the group's chances of survival in a world where nothing was stable. The young observed all of this with wide, silent eyes. They watched how hunters approached a weakened animal from the side instead of behind. They watched how decisions shifted depending on wind terrain or signs of predators. In time, these observations would guide their own hunts, but for now, they learned by memorizing patterns repeated in the land's quiet signals. When night came, the group ate sparingly, saving most of the catch for the days ahead. Fire crackled, and the smell of smoke clung to their skin. The hunters rested with the knowledge that tomorrow the land might present a different challenge, a new path, or an unexpected loss. But they also carried confidence formed from years of watching animals reading the land and adapting quickly. They chased survival not through strength alone, but through understanding the land's shifting language. Yet for all their knowledge, the earth often changed faster than they could learn its new patterns. Some change awaited them ahead, shaped by storms and silence, hiding consequences no hunter had yet imagined. They understood long before words existed that land could turn against them without warning. A place that once offered shade, water, and food could become a trap in a single night. Cracked soil, vanished rivers, smoke drifting from distant fires. Each sign whispered the same truth: it was time to leave. Migration was never a choice. It was a sentence delivered by the earth itself, forcing them to decide whether they would obey or be erased. The group began to read the land's refusal as clearly as they read the sky. When the land refused them, they lifted their eyes toward the stars. The night sky, vast and cold, became a silent guide long before compasses or maps existed. They knew constellations not as stories but as directions, fixed points in a world that refused to stay still. One bright star always held its place, anchoring their sense of distance and movement. The hunters memorized its alignment with jagged mountain peaks or the silhouettes of far-off cliffs. Children learned which stars dipped first below the horizon and which lingered until dawn. These lights in the sky served as the one map that disaster could not sweep away. Traveling by night was a necessity forced by the heat. The daytime sun did more than scorch skin. It drained strength, blurred vision, and pushed travelers toward collapse. Moving in darkness allowed them to conserve water and keep their pace steady. Their feet learned the feel of uneven ground without seeing it, stepping around stones and slipping between roots with a precision shaped by repetition. Torches were used sparingly, their flames shielded from wind and predators alike. The group relied instead on moonlight, pale and thin, stretching shadows across the path. They became silhouettes, moving through larger darkness, visible only to those who shared their journey. The land's dangers did not disappear at night. Predators moved silently, and the sound of distant howls often echoed across the plains. To survive, the group traveled in a loose formation, never too close to lose maneuverability, never too far to risk separation. Each person knew who they walked beside. Elders stayed near the center, protected by younger hunters. Children walked between adults' hands, lightly resting on arms or belts so they would not drift away. No voice rose above a whisper. Even whispers felt heavy in the cool night air, as if the world itself listened too closely. Breaking into smaller groups was a strategy born from loss. Large groups moved slowly, their sounds carrying farther across open landscapes. Disaster taught them that dividing into smaller units meant fewer people at risk if danger emerged suddenly. Each smaller group carried its own responsibilities: scouting, tracking, guarding, and carrying supplies. Though divided, they remained connected by shared direction and shared fear. The distance between them was small enough to allow signals, but large enough to scatter if a predator or sudden landslide tore through the path. During migration, water was treated as a blessing and a threat. Flooded areas signaled instability, while dried riverbeds forced longer detours. They searched for dew on grass at dawn, scraping droplets into small containers. They dug shallow pits near the roots of plants, waiting for moisture to gather. Every trick learned from generations of movement became essential. The children, though tired, learned to watch how the elders tested soil with their fingertips, or how they paused when the wind shifted. Migration trained the body, but danger shaped the mind. Food was scarce during long migrations. Hunting was unpredictable when animals fled the same disasters that drove humans away. Some days they found scattered bones picked clean by predators. On better days, they spotted tracks leading to small game that had not yet escaped. They rationed everything, chewing tough meat long after flavor disappeared, swallowing fat they had carefully preserved. Hunger gnawed at them, making even the simplest decisions heavy. Yet they pushed forward, step after step, following the stars like a promise. When exhaustion slowed them, the group rested in places chosen with caution. They slept in shallow depressions of land sheltered from the wind. They slept beneath overhanging rocks that had remained stable for generations. They slept in circles, backs together, spears and stones placed within reach. Sleep came in thin layers interrupted by sounds, a snapped twig shifting earth, distant thunder. They accepted unrest as part of survival. Rest did not need to be deep. It only needed to be enough to keep them standing. As days stretched into weeks, the land began to shift again. Signs emerged that they were getting closer to safer ground. Greener plants, thicker roots, the faint smell of moisture in the air. Birds returned to low branches. The sky changed color at dusk, less harsh, less metallic. These subtle changes offered hope, a quiet reminder that migration was not only about fleeing danger, but also about finding the next place to build, hunt, and breathe without fear. Hope was fragile, but it traveled with them, woven into every step taken toward unknown territory. The elders carried the weight of remembering the last journey who was lost, where the land collapsed, and how long the group had wandered. Their memories shaped decisions about which direction to follow and which valleys to avoid. They did not speak much, but their gestures guided the young. Every migration was a continuation of the one before it, a repetition of leaving what was once safe and trusting the sky instead of the soil beneath their feet. Migration was not an ending, it was a passage between two uncertainties. The group learned to accept that no place belonged to them forever. They belonged to a movement. They belonged to vigilance. They belonged to the knowledge that disaster could erase everything if they hesitated too long. They left the land behind before it consumed them, trusting the stars more than the ground beneath their feet. Even so, every step forward deepened the memory of places they could never return to. A presence waited in that unfamiliar distance, shaped by storms and silence, ready to reveal itself when the journey thinned their strength. Death was not a mystery to them. It walked beside their journeys, slipped between their shelters, and waited at the edges of their decisions. When one member of the group collapsed, whether from hunger, sickness, or the unseen force of the land, it was rarely sudden for those who watched closely. A failing body carried signs long before the final quiet. But for a world without words or theories, the death of one person meant something larger than loss. It became a warning carved into memory, pressed deeper than fear. They treated each tragedy as a note from the earth itself, telling them where not to return, where not to linger, and where danger had settled. Sometimes, the first sign came not from the dying person, but from the land beneath them. The ground would soften unexpectedly, as if it had been hollowed by water or weakened by shifting stone. A misstep could send someone tumbling into a hidden pocket of instability. The group learned to recognize these places by sight, the faint change in soil color, the unnatural tilt of a rock, or the way plants refused to root in certain patches. But recognition often came too late. When someone vanished into a collapse, their silent descent marked a boundary that would define the group's movements for seasons to come. Other times, death came with sound, a crack of stone overhead, the sudden snap of a branch weakened by the wind, the distant roar of water rushing through a narrow channel. The victim was often the one walking at the edge of the group, the one carrying heavy bundles, or the one slowing to check tracks. They died without knowing they were the first to meet a threat the others had not yet seen. Their passing turned into a signal stronger than any shout or gesture. Surviving members grew sensitive to shifts in the environment, treating every unfamiliar sound as a possible prelude to another disaster. But the most haunting deaths were the quiet ones, those taken by hunger, exhaustion, or sickness. The group moved as a single body, but weakness isolated individuals long before they stumbled. A fading step, a breath that rattled, trembling fingers, trying to grip a walking stick. Each sign etched worry into the eyes of the others. Yet they had no medicines, no shelters strong enough to stop the weather, no understanding of how sickness moved between them. When someone finally collapsed and stopped breathing, their body became a marker placed by nature itself. The group never camped in that exact spot again. They never hunted in the nearby thickets or drank from the same pool. Fear shaped their maps, and death drew the lines. The elders carried these memories with heavy stillness. They did not speak of the dead often, but their decisions revealed where danger had struck in previous generations. If an elder touched a young hunter's arm and shook their head at a certain valley, it was enough. No explanation followed. The place was forbidden. The group learned that behind every forbidden path was a story of someone who had fallen, someone whose last breath had purchased knowledge for those still walking. These unspoken lessons became the backbone of survival. Children absorbed these patterns long before they understood them. They watched where adults placed their feet, noted how quickly the group abandoned certain clearings, and learned to avoid the silent patches where animals refused to graze. Even without being told, children sensed the weight in the air near those places. The world itself felt heavier there. They learned that the final position of a fallen body mattered. If someone died facing a certain direction, that path was avoided. If they stumbled backward in terror, that area was marked as a place where danger approached unseen. There were times when the dead offered more than warnings. Their bodies became the last signs of what direction the group should flee. If a hunter found a companion who had collapsed with their arms stretched toward a narrow opening between rocks, the group moved away from that opening. If someone died while looking back over their shoulder, the danger was behind them, and the group shifted sideways across the terrain. Death wrote messages on the land in positions, gestures, and the stillness of limbs. Those who survived learned to read these messages as carefully as they read the stars. Not every lesson was immediate. Some deaths revealed their meaning only after many nights. When storms returned, when the wind carried the same scent as the night someone had vanished, when animals behaved with the same panic they had shown the day the last elder fell, the group recognized the pattern. These echoes between past and present shaped their decisions more strongly than any single event. This repetition of fear formed the core of their survival. The land killed one to save many, and the many learned to move with caution carved by grief. In some rare moments, death became the moment the group truly understood the threat. When a hunter was struck by falling stone, they learned to avoid cliffs after long rains. When a woman collapsed from drinking from a shallow pool, they realized the water had turned foul long before they tasted it. When a child disappeared during a quiet night, the group recognized the silent approach of predators they once thought harmless. Each life ended in a lesson that kept the group walking a little longer, watching a little more closely, breathing a little more carefully. In this way, death became a map drawn not with ink or carved lines, but with stories carried in the mind. It stretched across valleys, lakes, and forests, forming invisible barriers that shaped every journey. The dead did not speak, but they guided. They did not rise, but they pointed. The living did not worship them, but they followed the paths their absence created. They moved forward with the weight of those who had fallen, letting each loss mark the edges of safety. Yet every lesson carved from death exposed how thin their protection truly was. Another presence lingered in the distance, waiting to test whether their memories were enough to keep them alive. They learned early that memory alone was too fragile to protect them. Voices faded, elders died, and fear dimmed with time. But the land never forgot, and so they carved their warnings directly into it. When a mountain tore open with fire, or when a river rose high enough to erase an entire camp, they answered with stone. Hard surfaces became their way of resisting forgetfulness. Each carving, each mark, each symbol was a silent attempt to speak to the people who would come long after their own footprints had been washed away. They were not artists. They were survivors, shaping the earth into a long-lasting message. The first marks were simple, uneven, scratches, deep grooves, repeated lines. They carved them close to places where disaster had struck, as if anchoring the threat to a physical spot so no one could mistake it. The meaning was known only to those who lived through the event. A zigzag cut into stone told the story of a lightning strike that killed a hunter. A circular hollow represented a whirl of wind so violent that trees snapped like branches tossed into a fire. A tall, narrow mark spoke of water rising to the height of a grown man. But over time, these marks evolved. They became more deliberate, more precise, shaped through generations of loss. Volcanoes were carved as triangles with open tops, jagged lines spilling downward like streams of burning rock. Floods were drawn as layers of horizontal lines stacked unevenly, each one marking how high the water had climbed. Spirals represented whirlwinds, their centers darkened to remind the next generation where the force had been strongest. When a disease moved silently through the group, taking several people before anyone understood what was happening, they carved a cluster of small pits into rock, a soft indentation meant to reflect how quickly life could vanish. They placed stones in patterns as well, arranging them along paths where wind carried danger. A line of stones pointed toward the direction one should flee. A circle meant the opposite, a place where danger had gathered and where no one should approach. When fire consumed a forest, they stacked stones at its border as a reminder that the ground still held heat long after the flames faded. These arrangements were not random, though they might appear so to modern eyes. Each placement reflected the shared effort of people who knew they would not be the last to walk that path. These signs became a language older than speech. They traveled across generations in gestures, stories, and ceremonies. When the elders gathered the young around a large carved stone, they did not explain in long sentences. They tapped specific marks with sticks, traced lines with their fingers, and pointed toward mountains or rivers that had shaped their suffering. Children repeated the movements until they understood which symbol meant danger, which symbol meant shelter, and which symbol meant a story too heavy to tell plainly. These quiet lessons were the foundation of their survival. Rituals grew around these symbols. When a storm destroyed a settlement, the survivors returned days later to carve its shape into nearby rock, not out of respect for the storm, but out of obligation to those who would come after. It was a duty carried out without hesitation. They pressed stone against stone, letting grief guide their hands. When someone died in the disaster, a mark was added for them, often a small notch carved beside the larger symbol, as if the land needed to know the cost. Over the years, these paired symbols formed a memory. The land carried more faithfully than human voices ever could. Some carvings became so old that no one living understood their full meaning. The elders speculated based on the shapes, but the original events had long faded into time. Even so, they never ignored an ancient symbol. If a carving showed swirling lines, they avoided the area. If stacked stones leaned in a certain direction, they respected the warning even without knowing its origin. Fear filled the gaps that memory had lost. They believed that disasters repeated themselves, and the land used these signs to whisper reminders. In rare moments, groups traveling from different regions met and compared their symbols. They found similarities: triangles for mountains, spirals for wind, jagged lines for fire, even though the groups had been separated for generations. This told them something profound. Disaster shaped culture, carved identity, and created shared understanding regardless of distance. Their warnings were not local, they were human. A carved spiral meant danger whether found near the ocean or deep inside a valley. The world had taught them the same lessons. These symbols also marked safe places. Shallow arches carved into rock meant shelter from wind. Wide horizontal lines carved near caves meant stable ground. The groups needed reminders not only of where death had spread, but where life had been protected. These carvings told them where water had remained clean during a drought, where fire had stopped before reaching a clearing, and where animals consistently returned after storms. Hope, too, had to be recorded. When children grew older, they participated in carving, not as an artistic act, but as a step into responsibility. They learned that marks made today might save someone they would never meet. They felt the weight of the past pressing down on their hands as they carved. They understood that survival depended on remembering what the earth had done before. And when they left a place for the final time after a fire, a flood, or a death, they carved one last symbol, a boundary, a reminder, a promise that the story would not disappear. They etched the memory of disaster into stone, so that forgetting would never cost them again. Yet each mark only deepened the awareness that the land still held dangers they had not yet faced. A rising tension moved across distant ground, waiting to force another memory into the rock. Fear was never an enemy to them. It was a shape the world pressed into their bodies until the reaction became automatic. When the sky darkened in the wrong way, when animals fled in a single direction, when the air carried that thin metallic scent that preceded storms, they did not hesitate. Their feet shifted, their shoulders tightened, their eyes searched for escape paths carved by memory. Fear was not panic. It was information. It was the quiet signal that kept them alive when the earth changed faster than thought. Even in moments of stillness, fear rested lightly on their backs like a familiar weight. They prepared for disaster even when nothing seemed wrong. During calm days, they gathered leaves to reinforce their shelters. During quiet nights, they checked the stability of rocks around caves and added new supports where the earth had shifted. They stored food even when supplies seemed plentiful. They kept the fire alive even when warmth was not needed. These actions were not driven by imagination. They were shaped by long experience. They understood that danger did not announce itself with clarity. It arrived quietly behind silence, behind stillness, behind small changes that the careless would miss. Their routines followed, rules formed through generations of loss. When they walked near cliffs, they stepped lightly. When they crossed dry riverbeds, they moved quickly. When the ground felt hollow, they retreated without question. Pain had taught them these lessons. They remembered the cracks that had swallowed the careless, the sudden winds that had pushed children off ridges, the floods that rose faster than anyone expected. Every scar on their bodies came with a lesson. Every burial left a mark on the land that shaped the next decision. Pain was not simply endured, it was catalogued, it was carried forward. It became a system. The transformation of fear into instinct did not happen in a single life. It lived inside the group like a quiet inheritance. Children watched the elders tense when the air shifted, and over time they learned to tense at the same moment. They learned why a sudden silence in the forest mattered, why a trembling leaf meant more than beauty, why the movement of birds could reveal the direction of the wind before it touched the skin. Their senses sharpened through imitation. The group did not teach through explanation. They taught through repetition, feet moving, heads turning, and hands signaling danger before words existed. Fear shaped their shelters as well. They chose high ground not because it was comfortable, but because safety required it. They built entrances facing away from prevailing winds. They reinforced ceilings with layers of stone carried from far distances. They cleared brush around the camp so fire could not spread unseen. Every detail came from earlier mistakes. A fallen tree, a collapsed roof, a night when smoke nearly took their breath. Each event added another detail to the rules they followed without argument. In their movements across the land, fear served as a compass. When the air thickened with heat that did not match the season, they knew storms would arrive soon. When mist rose too quickly from the ground, they knew the earth beneath them was unstable. When animals disappeared from an area for too long, they understood that danger had already passed through. Fear filled the gaps that sight and hearing could not cover. It guided their choices with accuracy that modern knowledge would later recognize as intuition. There were days when fear saved them before they understood what was happening. A hunter would stop suddenly, sensing something wrong in the stillness of the trees. Within minutes, a branch would fall, or the ground would shift. A mother would pull her child closer without knowing why. Moments later, wind would tear through the clearing. These reactions were not accidents. They were the body's memory reacting before conscious thought. Instinct did what words could not. But fear also demanded discipline. They could not allow it to consume them. Panic would scatter the group, break the lines of communication, and lead to more deaths. So they learned to carry fear calmly. Their breathing remained steady, even when danger approached. Their steps remained measured. Their eyes scanned the landscape without rushing. They acted not through emotion, but through trained response. Fear gave the signal. Instinct handled the rest. The older members of the group carried fear differently. It rested deeper in their posture, shaped by decades of witnessing the land's shifts. They did not speak of what they had seen, but their silence conveyed enough. They walked with caution, carved into their movements. They positioned themselves near weak points in the camp. They checked structures without being asked. They watched the sky long after others had gone to sleep. It was their way of holding the group together. Over time, fear became a shared framework. It created unity. When danger appeared, no one questioned the signals of another. A raised hand, a short grunt, or the sudden stillness of the entire group all communicated danger more clearly than any language could. These reactions synchronized their movements, allowing them to escape disasters that would have overwhelmed individuals. Fear, once a solitary experience, became communal. When they reached old paths carved by ancestors, they paused. In carvings on stone and arrangements of rocks, they recognized warnings left long ago. Even without knowing the details, they understood that fear had been here as well. They read the landscape through the eyes of those who had lived and died before them. The symbols were reminders that survival required constant vigilance. The land did not change because people wished it to. The land changed because it obeyed forces beyond human understanding. Through these generations, fear stopped being something separate from them. It became part of their identity. It shaped their reasoning. It shaped their instincts. It shaped their memories. It taught them that survival did not belong to the strongest, but to the most attentive, the most adaptable, the most careful. Strength alone could not outrun a flood. Bravery alone could not stop fire. Only those who listened to the land, who respected the signs, who acted before disaster unfolded, continued walking. By the time night fell across their last camp, they no longer questioned why fear existed. It had carried them across storms, through droughts, and away from a collapsing earth. It had sharpened their senses and kept their group alive long after others had vanished. Fear was not the enemy, it was the first teacher, and it would remain with them, guiding every step into the uncertain days ahead. Now, as this story closes, let the quiet settle. Let the weight of their journey soften in your mind. Let the night hold you gently the way fire once held them against the cold. Good night. Rest safely. May your dreams stay warm, even when the world outside shifts in ways we cannot see.